Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our second webinar just for our discussion on Italy, life under lockdown and life beyond COVID-19. We're delighted to have Tobias Jones here as our guest, live from his apartment in Parma. For those that don't know Tobias, he's the author of 5 works of non-fiction, including Ultra, that looks at football violence in Italy, and the best-selling The Dark Heart of Italy and Blood on the Altar, as well as 3 crime novels set in Italy. He's also a frequent contributor to The Guardian and a broadcaster with Rai. And for those that don't know me, I'm Nicholas Wood. I run Political Tours. We're the only travel company in the world to specialize in current affairs. And we're running these webinars alongside our sister company, Beyond the Headlines. Italy, as we all know, has been really the worst hit of all the countries in Europe by the novel coronavirus. It's had the highest death rate of all EU states. Its health service has been left reeling. It's also had to introduce stringent quarantine measures, and really the rest of Europe has had to follow several weeks afterwards. And so it's to that extent, we're looking to see what we can learn from Italy. In about 20 minutes or so, we'll be able to take questions from people. We'll be able to put questions to Tobias. But before that, I want to get an idea of how the crisis unfolded. And there are 3 particular things as well that I'd like to know in our discussion with Tobias. Namely, what has been the impact on society and on the economy in Italy? What's the relationship now with Europe? We know that there's been a lot of friction between the EU, or particularly between the Commission and the Italian government. And then something that Tobias has been particularly strong on is how is Italy, how are we all going to change? How is Italian society going to change? But also how is society within Europe going to change as a consequence of this virus? Tobias, thank you very much for giving up some of your time.
Not at all. Good evening.
Can you just go back a couple of weeks or back a month or so, just to that period of uncertainty as the virus, as the number of cases were beginning to crop up in Italy, and as the number of deaths were cropping up in Italy? Here we can look at a map, and we can see actually how close you live here. You're in Parma. And the first few cases were just breaking out just a bit to the north. So if you could just talk a bit about that period back then, what was happening, and then as we've got the maps here, we can also talk about the progression of the virus as it spread from Lombardy. You can see the cases there, Lombardy up in dark red, and then just below it, that next darker section, the smaller one just there, that's where Parma's just at the very top end of that. Can you just talk about the situation back then, which people really didn't fully understand what was coming, I think I'm right in saying?
No, I don't think anyone knew really. Good evening, everyone. My next book is, I don't know if we can see the map previously that shows Codogno so close to Parma. My next book is, there we go, traveling the entirety of the River Po. So that goes from the Venetian lagoon that you can see there, almost directly between Parma and Codogno. And I've just reached there by early February. And I'm, traveling on foot, boat, bike, train, car, whatever. And in early February, we knew, as everyone in the world did, there was a big virus in China. It had been shut down, there were deaths. And I was in precisely that area with a friend. And you had this kind of sense it's never going to happen here. And things snowballed very, very quickly. So 6 weeks ago, our children were told they couldn't go to school. So that was middle of February. And, they were happy. It seemed like a holiday. It was very exciting. And it snowballed very quickly. So Italy went into lockdown on the 7th of March. That was first Emilia-Romagna and Lombardy. So those 2 areas you can see in blue and green. And then very quickly, the whole of the country was put into lockdown. And that was shocking for, everyone in Europe. And I wrote an article at the time, and it was extraordinary that the country had 1,000 deaths, and we thought, blimey, this is a very serious situation. Now, a month later, we have 18,279 deaths. These are extraordinary figures. So Lombardy alone, that area you can see in blue, has had over 10,000 deaths. Emilia-Romagna, where I live, has had 2,300. So you have this extraordinary concentration of cases, and there are all sorts of reasons and hypotheses about why that might be. One of the things that happened just before the national lockdown was that on the Saturday night, it was leaked, accidentally or deliberately, that this was going to happen. So tens of thousands of people from northern Italy, especially from Milan, took trains to the centre and south to be with their families, girlfriends, whoever it was, grandchildren, grandparents, whatever. So unfortunately, through that leak, you then get a lot of people heading south. And since then, really, Italy's been an outrider for not only Europe, but I think the Western world. We watched in astonishment as Australia and America and Britain and Spain all went about their daily business in what we thought was a very blasé way. One of the amazing things here is how very quickly human behavior changed. So for us, it very quickly became almost, well, more than almost, it became a faux pas to stand within 2 meters of someone, to go out without a mask. Very quickly people were wearing surgical gloves. And one of the interesting things is that all the stereotypes about Italy, that it's chaotic and rule bending and disobedient, it wasn't the case. I think Italians realized this was an extremely serious health issue. And one of the things that, we've been asking ourselves here in Italy is how much our messages as journalists or politicians or medics weren't listened to because of this sort of prejudice about Italy. So we saw, for example, Atletico Madrid playing football against Liverpool in Anfield. We saw the Cheltenham Festival, the horse racing thing going ahead. We saw thousands of people gathering on Bondi Beach. We saw the New York Metro. And we'd been blasé a month before, so it's, it's not as if we're much wiser, but this sort of almost not wanting to believe the seriousness of the crisis was, I think, very costly, both for Italy and for the rest of the world.
In a moment, we're going to see some video which you kindly shot towards quite early on. I think about sort of 10 days into the lockdown, and I think this was your first trip, one of your first trips out of the apartment as a reporter.
So this is Parma, a rather beautiful city of about 200,000 people, and this is my suburb, slightly far outside the city centre. And this is the first time I've been outside the house for almost 10 days. You're not allowed outside the house for any reason other really than walking your dog, shopping, and anything essential. The police will stop you, the patrols will ask to see your documents, your justification. And part of the problem of being locked up at home, apart from the fact we've got 3 children who are going stir crazy, is that you don't really sleep at night. You're not getting any exercise, any fresh air, so you feel sort of lethargic during the day, and then at night you're not tired enough to sleep. And all the while spring is bursting. This avenue, as you can probably see, is normally full of cherry blossom at this time of year, and it's spring is going before we've even seen it, in a way. So this is something I've never seen. This road here is called Lo Stradone, the big road, and I've never seen so few cars on it. Normally they're end to end, morning, noon and night. You can see there's a bit of traffic, but hardly anyone. So every time you come shopping, you'll see a long queue of people, all devoutly standing 2 or 3 meters apart. Almost everyone has face masks. There are probably only 20 or 30 people inside this huge supermarket, and they'll be given gloves when they go inside. And sometimes it can take 2-3 hours to get into the actual shop itself. And the queues just snake round and round. This, bear in mind, is a supermarket in the suburbs. There's been not that much hoarding, but purchases of longer lasting foodstuffs, rice, pasta, yeast, tin foods have increased hugely in recent days. And here you can see the queues still going around the block. And these people will be here probably for another 2 hours, 3 hours at least. So we're coming now to Piazza della Pace, one of the lovely squares in the city, and behind it is the Pilota Palace, which was they were the lords of this city in the Middle Ages, who became popes. Very powerful family. It's missing a corner because it was bombed by the Allies in the Second World War. And again here you can see hardly anyone. It's spring now. Normally you see here dozens of people, just a few dog walkers. So this is something you see quite a lot. You'll see people hanging out on the balconies, the rainbow sign, often with children's hands or smiley faces, saying "Andrà tutto bene," it'll all be okay, with underneath the slogan "Io resto a casa," I'm staying at home. And above that you can see Italian flags.
The other thing that really sort of comes home to me is that you know these people, because the deaths have been really quite concentrated in the area where you live. You're surrounded by this, perhaps in a way that that perhaps we aren't here in the UK. With many of these, obviously, there's a lot happening in London, but that's a very big city. But this is really quite concentrated in your area.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, one of our friends, Antonella, has lost both of her parents. Her husband is in hospital and her sister is in hospital. You know, just to give you an idea of the concentration of tragedy in the family, that one friend. And, you know, here I've got today's copy of La Gazzetta di Parma, which is Italy's oldest newspaper, they say. And, you know, every day they normally have obituaries which will fill half a page. And here you can see every paragraph here is not just the photos. Every paragraph will be someone who's died. And it goes on and on. You know, Parma alone has lost 5 priests. You know, 125 nurses and doctors in Italy have died. And, you know, I know similar things are now happening in New York and London. Of course, Boris Johnson is in intensive care. So these things are sort of almost normalized, I suppose. Spain's having a similar thing. But I think because Italy was maybe the first European country to go through this, it felt like they wanted to give a good account of themselves. And, you know, I'm sure you saw all those images of the singing on the balcony or the applause to the health workers. And that's something that's, you know, almost all countries have tried to imitate. And some of it gave you goosebumps. You know, some of that stuff was remarkable. You know, we would be here and the balcony in front of us, these neighbours that we never really even talk to or know, because we're in a sort of suburban setting where you don't necessarily know them, you're suddenly asking, oh, how's your family? How's your father? How's your elderly mother? So there's this sudden sort of incredible communal bonding going on as you go onto your balconies. And the other thing that's happened here, and I'm sure it's happening everywhere, but again, because it happened first in Italy, is this incredible uplifting sort of comeback of nature. So you have these dolphins leaping for joy in Venice. You have ducks splashing in Piazza di Spagna. You have deer walking across golf courses outside Milan. You know, you can hear the bird song. Where I live, Parma's got some of the worst air quality in the whole of the world. I mean, it's grim. And yet, you know, the sky is blue. So there's this sort of strange juxtaposition of horrific personal stories and sort of uplifting communal bonding and natural restoration, if you like, going on.
Yeah. Well, we've got plenty of questions. I want to raise everyone's attention just so that you can ask questions too. If you look at your screen, if everyone looks at their screen, if you put the cursor down to the bottom, you'll see various options. And there's one called Q&A. And if you click on that, you can literally type questions in. So if you please do go ahead and start hammering away questions in there. And we also have the option, if we see you've got a question, we have the option to go to you, and so that we can turn on your microphone, so that you can actually ask Tobias a question live. So please, you know, do get tapping away there while we speak. You wrote quite a bit about how Italian society, you thought, you know, and I can see it here as well, here in the UK, in the village where we live. I've had far more contact, far more conversations from a distance 2 meters away, and there's a sense of support. You've written about that coming together of people and how you're looking out for each other. And then pitted against that, and on national level, within the European Union, there's this sense of Italy being left alone. So perhaps you could talk about those two opposing elements.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the coming together, you know, Italians are very generous anyway. It's a country of contradiction. So, you know, it has a problem with the far right and xenophobia and all the rest. And yet there's great generosity. So, for example, you have these wicker baskets all over towns and cities in which people are invited to put any surplus produce they have, and anyone who needs can come and take it. You know, just anecdotally here, the sharing of not just newspapers, but the distribution of food, the fact that, you know, schooling is trying to go on digitally, meeting as we are now, but trying to do that with 20 or 25 students, of whom a quarter don't have computers. You know, one of my son's friends doesn't have a computer in his family, and that's the case for a quarter of Italian families don't have an internet connection. That's from the National Statistics Agency. So education is very difficult. So what you're finding is people are taking old tablets or mobile phones to young kids so they can just get on with their schooling. There are all sorts of stories like that. And yet, as you say, there is a sense that, I mean, it's a twofold problem, Italy's issue with the European Union. One is the immediate one in recent days, really, and it's escalating every day, the rhetoric from both sides. Italy feels it is in a profound economic crisis. It's part of the European Union. It doesn't have all the levers of control because, you know, it's part of the euro and there are restrictions on what it can do. So it's looking to Berlin and Paris and so on for support, and it feels it's had nothing. And even the very measured president of the Republic, Mattarella, said, you know, almost in gritted teeth, this is a man who's in his 80s. His brother was murdered by the mafia. You know, this is our equivalent of the British Queen. And he said, you know, we need solidarity. We need solidarity, and really nothing is being forthcoming. Lagarde, you know, she said it's not our responsibility to minimise the spreads, and of course at that point, the 10-year yields on Italian bonds spiked more in a day than ever because of the, you know, the sense that Italy was a risky place to lend to. And, you know, the economic figures here are frightening. You know, I think without wanting to sort of sideline the human issues, the Italian economy is very, very, very troubled. You know, when you and I, with various people who are present tonight, were traveling around Italy a year ago or whenever it was, we were talking about the level of public debt, and it sort of hovers between 130 and 140% of GDP. That's going to go through the roof. You know, if you think 5 or 6% of Italian GDP is tourism, it's going to get zero from that this year, and probably close to zero next year as well. There are normally tourists book 210 million nights in Italian hotels in a year. That's almost going to be non-existent. So, yeah, it's, you know, anecdotally again, so many of our friends, we've got a friend who delivered us some beer this evening for the weekend, and, you know, his pub is closed. It's been closed for almost 2 months. What can you do?
We've got some good questions coming through. And I think I might, in a second, if Susan doesn't mind, there's one of our, somebody here we know who lives in Italy, and she's got a good question to you. So if Isabel can turn Susan Scrimgeour's microphone on, if Susan's okay to that, I think I'll let Susan ask her question. But Hazel asked a question about the children. I think you addressed that earlier about how people were being, you know, the computers in the apartments. Perhaps you want to talk about that briefly. I mean, you've got children. How are they dealing with it psychologically? And then I'll come to Susan if she's ready as well.
Well, I can answer the personal question very quickly. You know, we are thankfully a happy, contented family. Our children's ages 9, 13, 15. We're in that lovely situation where the oldest isn't into sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and the youngest one doesn't wet his bed at night. And, you know, we have a weekly table tennis tournament. It's my turn to organise it this Sunday, so I've got to guarantee that the youngest one wins. I play left-handed, because otherwise I would win. But, you know, you see, that's the strange juxtaposition. We are cheerful and happy and almost enjoying this strange time. So, yeah, we're fine.
Yeah. Susan, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go on, far away.
It's a simple enough question, I think, that now that so many countries are in lockdown, the next critical stage is what are the parameters for emerging from lockdown? And we see that in Wuhan, that's beginning to happen, although it's not quite clear exactly how they're doing it. But from my perspective, without the advent of some decent testing to know what immunity is around, without some idea of whether immunity is something that will last, if people have had the disease and they go back out into the big wide world, will it continue to protect them? And without there being any vaccine available for 12 to 18 months, I'm not sure what an exit plan looks like. And I just wondered whether in Italy, because Italy is a bit further ahead than us, there were more discussions and more clarity on how that might take shape.
Yeah, hi Susan. I don't know, I'm not an expert on these things. What I have been reading is that, you know, we've all heard about the famous curve, you know, it's going to go up and it's going to go down, and people are saying actually it's a loop, that it's going to sort of circle, and I don't know. The exit strategy is very problematic, like you say, without testing, without some kind of passport. I mean, what a lot of us are asking ourselves, and I'm sure it's the case with all of you, is have I actually had it? You know, I had that strange cough 2 months ago. The children had a bit of bronchitis. You know, we don't even know who's had it and who hasn't had it. So, yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is that schools, obviously, Italian schools aren't going to go back till September. It's likely that even then there'll be social distancing and masks. So I don't know, but that's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah,
I can't answer, I'm afraid.
Thank
Susan,
you. No, I think that's the big thing that's entering everyone's mind now is that we're doing the lockdown and we're doing our best to do it the right way. It's not perfect, but it's as good as it gets at the moment. But when is the end in sight? Because we can't sort of continue with this forever. There's got to be some balance with the economy at some point. Otherwise, we create such colossal problems for ourselves. But just how do we emerge from it all? That, I think that's the big thing that's completely cloudy at the moment. But we'll wait and see, I guess. Lots of questions, no good answers.
I mean, I think on that, one of the interesting things, tragic things about the Italian situation is that, you know, it had this incredibly high case fatality rate. And there, you know, it's a huge debate about why that was. Probably because there wasn't that widespread of testing. So, you know, it looked like the numbers were at 9-10%, when in Germany it was 0.2 or whatever. But I think one of the reasons for that mortality rate is that 100% of the intensive care beds were occupied in Lombardy. So there's this sort of feeling that actually you can cope with the virus if there are the beds. I mean, you know, it's one of those unknowns, isn't it?
There are three questions here that have been asked on the question and answer section, and that sort of follow into each other, and from Simon Jackson and also from Glyn Gill. And the first question Simon asks is, you know, how is the government perceived? I mean, there's a lot of anger towards Germany, there's a lot of anger with the EU, but surely the government should be held responsible in some way. And the government did resist, actually, having the lockdown. The Prime Minister resisted having a lockdown for quite some time when local officials were saying, look, you've got to do something about it. And he was saying, no, we need to have the economy ticking over, which is what I think we saw in the UK as well. So could you address that? And then another question that both Simon has asked and Glyn Gill, how do people, what drew the virus to Lombardy? We know a bit about the stories there, how it actually got there. But what do Italians think was responsible? How was that handled? So both those sort of two questions interact with each other.
Yeah, thank you. I've heard very little criticism of the government in terms of the speed at which it locked down. I mean, I think most people think it acted far swifter than, say, for example, the UK or the US. The difference here is that Italy has very powerful regions, and actually, if you compare the regions, so for example, the Veneto, which at one point seemed as if it was on the same trajectory as Lombardy, actually very quickly seemed to, if not solve, flatten and lower the famous curve. And that's because they did all the things that we now know are very important. They did immense amount of testing, were very, very strict about social distancing, very clear messaging, and Lombardy had none of that. So I think a lot of the criticism is more on a regional basis than on a national basis. I mean, it's true that, you know, Conte would do these strange things. So he would make his announcement at 11:30 on Facebook, which, you know, doesn't seem a very statesmanlike way to make an announcement onto a, you know, social media platform. But on the whole, you know, everyone's made mistakes, I'm sure. But I think actually his approval ratings have gone up, not down. And many people are thinking, blimey, if we still had Salvini as the Minister of the Interior, we'd be in real crisis. So
well, let me come back to you on that. John Ehrenreich, who was on our tour, I don't know if you can remember John from last year.
Of course I do.
And perhaps, Isabel, we could pass John, we could open up John's microphone, because he's asked a question that several people have asked, which really is a follow-up onto what you've just been talking about. How is this going to play out over the next year? Surely it strengthens Salvini's hand. For those of you who don't know, Salvini leads this nationalist anti-EU movement, and he's moved from having this northern independent party, the Lega Nord, to having a pan-nationalist, a pan-Italian nationalist movement that's done very well recently, and he was the interior minister. John, are you there?
I'm here.
John, ask your question.
Okay, first of all, great to see your face, Toby and Nicholas, and glad that you're well. I'm curious again about the reaction to the government and criticism of the government. I was just reading this morning that in Spain, the government's approval for handling of the crisis has fallen quite dramatically, down in the 30% range. In the United States, it's pretty polarized, as one would expect, with Democrats disapproving and Republicans approving. But after an initial little bump of support for Trump in a context of crisis, his approval ratings have been falling fairly rapidly. So I'm just wondering what the impact you think is going to be in Italy, or is it too soon to have any sense of that at all?
Well, I mean, I think those I speak to have said to me, and I talk to a lot of people from the right as well as from the left and the centre, that actually a lot of the sort of gloss and shine has come off Salvini. I mean, he's, you know, if there's one word you'd never use for him, it's statesman-like. And one of the consequences, I think, of this crisis is that actually it shows the need for serious, intelligent, rational, considered politicians who are able to make very difficult decisions in extremely complex, fast-moving situations. And I don't think anyone would say Salvini is that sort of politician. You know, he's throughout this crisis. I mean, he was saying long after Zingaretti, you know, Zingaretti is the leader of the opposition, the left-wing party. He went to Milan, and it's partly that reaction that you have after a terrorist incident. You say, we've got to go on with our life as it was. Zingaretti went to Milan and said, no, we've got to, you know, power through this, all those cliches. He got coronavirus and, you know, has barely been seen since. Salvini was very much saying, no, we need to open everything, keep the restaurants open, keep the cinemas open, keep the schools open. And then he was seen skiing in the mountains and sort of, you know, sharing classes. And I don't think he's come out of this at all well. And neither have those other slightly sort of flip-floppy far-right parties that come up with a different policy idea every week. So, you know, Italians are famously, notoriously dismissive of their politicians. And, you know, I think there is a dearth of a political class in Italy, and dare I say it, in much of the Western world at the moment. So that's a problem. But I mean, I think Conte hasn't had a lot of flack, to be honest.
But to pin you down on that, just to make your prediction, for the moment you see Conte staying in power, for the moment you see the government, you know, the crisis has boosted his reputation, at least for the moment, and you don't see any major changes. But just friction with Europe, that the situation with the European Union, some people talk about, well, no, Italy, you know, finally, does this mean the end of Europe? But you know, Italy really is, it can't leave the European Union. There's no choice for that. So really things have to carry on as they are in a way.
Yeah, I mean, ask yourselves, who would you vote for if you were in Italy? You know, if you go through the parties, you've got the Five Star Movement, who's...
But you're a wet liberal like me, so that doesn't count.
Say again?
You're a wet liberal like me, so that doesn't count.
You don't want to talk about my politics, do you? No, I mean, you know, the Five Star Movement, one of their famous policies was anti-vaccination. Not a good time to push that one, I wouldn't suggest. The left-wing party, you know, they don't have a huge amount of support for a variety of reasons. You know, I don't know who you would vote for. You know, the far-right parties, and I include Salvini in that, you know, have been coming out with a different policy every day, and none of it's very convincing. Berlusconi is now 84. I mean, he's got a new girlfriend, but, you know, he's not going to go on forever.
There are no real alternatives to the current government. That's what you're saying.
No, but then Conte doesn't have a political party. He's not the leader of any political movement. He's there as a, you know, as a law professor. 2 years ago, he was setting exams in university in Tuscany. So,
yeah,
you know, trying to make predictions about Italian politics is.
So Stuart Williams has got a question here, which is pretty straightforward. What measures have been taken by the government in Italy to furlough workers and subsidize costs of businesses?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good evening. So basically, they've put aside 25 billion euros, and there's a raft of measures there. So they've put aside 150 million euros for doctors overtime. Junior doctors have been promoted to full status. One of the interesting things is that they have, and this is one of the questions about, you know, how far draconian measures are enlightened or worrying. Part of this emergency decree is that any building can be requisitioned. You know, so we're talking hotels, schools, and it makes sense in the context of the current crisis. But a lot of people worried about civil liberties are saying, you know, this is a worry. 85 million euros has been put aside for digital learning in schools. Sole traders like myself, anyone with a VAT number, have been offered 600 euros, but then when we all went on the website to claim it, the whole site crashed and was hacked. So there's been 3.2 million euros set aside for unemployment benefit. I mean, there's quite a lot, nothing like what has been suggested in Britain. You know, it's kind of stuff like 100 euros for those who've still gone to work regularly in the last month. 2 million euros for taxi drivers who've had to insert perspex between the driver's side and the customer's side for social distancing. It's, you know, I don't think it's anything like enough. There are mortgage holidays, there are the suspensions of speeding fines, there's you know, there's going to be no evictions for failure to pay rent in the next 2 months, but you know, it's pretty thin. Yeah.
What's the debate at the moment about easing measures? I mean, we can see this cropping up here in the UK. There's obviously a big debate about the huge impact on the economy as you've outlined. So what are people saying about in terms of relaxing measures?
Well, at the moment, what I'm hearing is it's going to be early May. So, you know, whatever that is, 3-4 weeks away. But, you know, we've had so many deadlines that have come and gone. You know, we had in our minds the 3rd of April, that's when things were going to be lifted, and now it's the 3rd of May, more or less. And it's exactly what Susan was saying. You know, what's the exit strategy? How do you do that? How do you make that work? So it's very difficult to say. I mean, I think certainly there are parts of Italy which are worrying at the moment. I think Milan has an increase in case. And in terms of, you know, your question about how this was diffused, one of the major thoughts is that there was a very, very big football match between Valencia and Atalanta. And those of you who follow football / soccer, you know, Atalanta is this sort of fairy tale in the European Champions League, who were, you know, this sort of small city that were hoping to do great things. And of course, you know, being from Bergamo and meeting all those people in Milan and all those Spaniards from Valencia, then going back to Bergamo, and they were in Milan because their stadium's being rebuilt. You know, one of the thoughts is that caused the diffusion of the virus. But I think, you know, Milan is a worry. We're hearing early May, but you know,
a lot of people have been articles and across papers across Europe about this is going to change society. This is going to change economies. We're not going to come out on the other side of this the same. And that doesn't just mean economically, but they're also referring to the way we behave, the way that this might lead to a shift in culture, the shift in the way societies behave. And you've written about that quite extensively. And that's also partly from a point of view as what you'd want to change. Can you just outline a bit about some of the things you've been writing about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always accused of being too optimistic, unlike most people. So I do try and sort of see the positives. I mean, you know, I can list very quickly what I see as positives. I think we've seen a return of truth. You know, it's truism of modern life that we live in a post-truth age, and suddenly we see actually truth in terms of reporting, in terms of there's information, combating conspiracy theories. Truth is suddenly very important, and it's amazing that it's taken this crisis for the social media companies actually to combat the dissemination of fake news, which they didn't do in certain referenda and elections recently. So I think the return to truthfulness is important. I think we have rediscovered the importance of boundaries and membranes. That, you know, I'm an internationalist, and you know, those of us who are internationalists have probably been slower to realise this, that actually communities, and it's something that Elinor Ostrom said, you know, the Nobel Prize winning political scientist, the primary importance in a functioning community is to control who comes in and comes out. And I think that's something we've rediscovered, and maybe isn't always a bad thing. And I don't say that from a xenophobic point of view. I think we've replaced a lot of grievance with gratitude. You know, I've never seen so much applause on the news. I've never seen so many clappy emojis in social media feeds and messages. And I think that's a good thing. You know, that we're discovering that community actually means a pooling of the newness of our obligations and duties. I think that the despotism of the market, the market fundamentalism has been overthrown, because we've realised that actually the famous invisible hand, the level playing field, all those cliches that we've heard for many years, that the market will resolve all our problems, is, I need to watch my language, not true. That we've marketised everything in terms of marketising hospitals, schools, the future. And, you know, one of the things that this crisis has shown up is that actually it's very important to, not that, you know, societies need a market. I'm not saying this from a communist point of view. I understand the importance of markets. Societies need a market, but markets shouldn't have society. And that's what we've had for the last 20 or 30 years. I think that's certainly positive.
As part the counter argument, and this leads into a question from Cornelia Meyerberg. If Isabel, can you put Connie's microphone? I hope Connie's not going to be too surprised if we switch our microphone on. So I'm just giving some warning there. But there's a slight counter narrative to that, is that really Italy's in this crisis because its economy was in such a bad shape beforehand, because it's got such high debt. The failure of the EU, the reticence of countries like Germany and the Netherlands to help bail Italy out, or help bail out the southern states of Europe out, is understandable, because they've managed their economies for such a long period of time. So, you know, why do it? So that, I think that's, and I think your neighbour was even telling you that the other evening. But is Connie there?
Yes, I am. Good to hear you.
So Connie, far away with your question, which is sort of related to that, but not directly.
Yes, hello, good evening, everyone. Hi from Vienna. Tobias, nice to meet you.
You too.
My question is, in parts of Northern Europe, people think that Italy, in a way, with its very heavy insistence on Euro bonds or Corona bonds, is in a way using this terrible crisis to push through an old demand, because Brussels is discussing in which form this solidarity should come, which financial instruments should be used. Do you think Italy would go also for financial supports which are not Eurobonds, financial support which comes maybe with some sort of strings attached? Or do you see that they just will insist and there will be no room for compromise? Thank you.
Just to sort of follow that up, there has been some intervention by the ECB with them buying back bonds, but they've resisted from going, and the minutes of the last meeting showed that Lagarde actually tried to support Italy, supporting something like the Corona bonds idea, but there was big resistance from the other central bank chiefs at that meeting. Am I right? I think I'm right in saying that, Connie. You correct me if I'm wrong.
Probably you're more, you know the status quo better on that than me.
Well, Tobias, just reply to that one anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can entirely understand any reticence from Central or Northern Europe against lending money to Italy. You know, if it was my pocket I'm putting the hand in, I would think very long and hard, and I'm not sure I would do it. What I would say, and the reason I was shaking my head when you were talking, Nicholas, is that actually the paradox here is that this is a country with huge amounts of public debt, as we know, but it's also got huge amounts of private wealth. It's got far more private wealth than Britain has when you look at the figures in terms of a per capita wealth, and which leads a lot of us to suggest, and there are a lot of economic statistics on this, that the problem, the economy is a problem. I'm not denying the Italian economy is in deep crisis, but the problem is also tax evasion. You know, if it were possible to guarantee a reliable fiscal flow, then actually, some of these problems could be dealt with. And we've got in this vicious cycle. And if you look at the statistics of, the cost of buying a house, you look at the graphs, it's down here in the States, and it's down here in Australia and Austria. And I've looked at a graph, and then suddenly in Italy, it's up here. And that's all tax. So any fixed taxation you can get is swiped by the state, but the degree of evasion when it's possible is staggering. There's immense private wealth in Italy. I mean, I was looking for the figure just before we came online. I didn't find, and I'm sure Lynn could probably tell us, but it's trillions of euros. Mm.
There's a good comment from Stuart Williams here, who says perhaps the government are constrained by membership of the Eurozone, and that life would be much better without it.
Well, I don't want to dive into a Euro debate whether they should be members or not. But throughout the entirety of the post-war years, the First Republic, from 1948 to 1992, they just repeatedly devalued. They devalued the lira. Their exports were doing very well, and they were obviously more competitive. And that's not something they can do. It's true. Right.
Well, chaps, I think we're coming towards a close there. I think we've gone through quite a few questions there, had a good debate. Next week, we've got another talk that takes place on Thursday evening as well, and that's on Lebanon. And the focus there is we've chosen Lebanon because we've traveled there a lot, we know it very well, but it's an example of a state that has got historic problems, as we all know. It's been dealing with a colossal debt problem, and it certainly doesn't have the infrastructure to deal with a crisis like the coronavirus. So we'll be drawing, as we draw this discussion to a close, our next one will take place next Thursday evening. It is, if I'm right, it is at 8 p.m. BST, British Summer Time. And we'll be sending out emails and details about that. And that will be with Lina Saidi, who's a Lebanese journalist, and Nick Blandford, who's a fellow with the Atlantic Council. And we'll also have some video footage, I hope, of some parts of Beirut that give you a really very, very different perspective on how COVID-19 can affect a much poorer nation and poorer communities. So I want to thank Tobias once again for his
thank you for
having me, giving up his time and answering all our questions. And thank you all for putting some very good questions to him as well. We'll leave it there, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Goodbye for now.